On the chilly evening of January 30th, 2026, Buckingham Palace stunned the world with a declaration that seemed to tear through 70 years of carefully maintained royal secrecy. In a statement so precise, it could have been surgical, yet shockingly explosive in its implications, Lady Louise Windsor, the quiet, almost invisible 22-year-old granddaughter of Queen Elizabeth II, was revealed as the official inheritor of a Scottish estate so secret, even the highest-ranking members of the royal family had barely heard of it. They called it the Grey House, a name spoken only in hushed tones within the inner sanctums of the palace, a property so fiercely hidden that its very existence had been treated almost like classified intelligence. And this is where the story takes a sharp and dramatic turn. For months before the announcement, behind the thick, imposing oak doors of Clarence House, a far darker narrative had been unfolding, written in whispers, secrecy and quiet strategy. Queen Camilla, together with the Parker Bowles clan, had been waging a relentless and clandestine battle to claim the estate as their own. They had surveyors at the ready, a battalion of high-priced lawyers, and elaborate plans to transform this secluded sanctuary into a monument to their influence and legacy. Every calculation had been made, every strategy meticulously crafted. They were certain of triumph, and yet, in a stunning twist, they walked away with nothing. What follows is not merely a story about land or inheritance. It is a saga of raw ambition, family rivalry, betrayal, and the emergence of one young woman as the unexpected custodian of the late Queen's most sacred and private secrets. To understand why this inheritance caused shockwaves reverberating through the monarchy, we need to step inside the Grey House itself. This was no ordinary royal residence nestled in the harsh and rugged terrain of the Scottish Highlands. It was Queen Elizabeth II's private soul space, quietly acquired in 1952, the year she ascended the throne amidst mourning and ceremony. The deed carried no royal title. There was no public acknowledgement. It was concealed behind a private holding company, meticulously crafted to remain invisible for generations. While the world knew Elizabeth as a queen of dutiful performance, the Grey House bore witness to Elizabeth, the woman. It was a place where her red boxes arrived daily, where state matters were conducted in absolute isolation, far from press scrutiny or royal protocol. So remote was this sanctuary that Prince Philip reportedly despised its isolation, and King Charles had never once walked its stone paths. This unfamiliarity would later become Charles's Achilles heel when the Parker Bowles family tried to seize control. But Elizabeth had been playing a much longer game. She understood that the crown's true legacy was not in the glitter of jewels or the prestige of titles, but in the unfiltered and private history stored within those stone walls. By choosing Louise, a granddaughter with a shared love of silence, history, and thoughtful reflection, the late Queen bypassed present-day ambitions to preserve the memory of the past. Over the course of this journey, you will see how a single clause, written with surgical precision in a private deed, explicitly blocked the Parker Bowles family. You will watch how Lady Louise Windsor, at just 22, became the sole keeper of the real Elizabeth, the woman behind the crown. The battle for the Grey House was over before it had even begun, and the consequences promised to reshape the monarchy for decades to come. To grasp the magnitude of this palace scandal, one must first understand the enigma of the Grey House itself. For over 70 years, the British monarchy maintained a complete blackout of information around this multi-million-pound estate, buried within the meticulous ledgers of the Duchy of Lancaster and the private accounts of the sovereign. The property was never referenced by name. Instead, it was concealed under the mundane administrative label of site fee, appearing to auditors and curious officials as a minor land management expense or a routine utility cost. In essence, it was a masterstroke of hiding in plain sight. The Grey House sits in the most unforgiving reaches of the Careen Goms in the Scottish Highlands. This is not the gentle, rolling green of Balmoral captured in glossy holiday snapshots. These are granite peaks, ancient Caledonian pine forests, and wind-whipped moors where storms can turn lethal in moments. The house itself rests in a natural bowl, tucked between historic hunting corridors once favoured by Queen Victoria, deliberately invisible to any modern hiking trail or public viewpoint. The story of its acquisition reveals Elizabeth II's tactical brilliance. Within months of her father's death and her own sudden ascent to the throne, while being fitted for a crown and thrust under a global spotlight, she quietly secured a backdoor to private reality. The detail that would later confound Queen Camilla's legal advisors was this: the deed made no mention of a royal title, Her Majesty, or the Crown Estate. It was purchased through a private holding company managed by a financial advisor who had overseen the Queen Mother's private Highland estate, ensuring it would remain Elizabeth's private property under civil law, immune to royal protocol. The house itself mirrored its owner. Sombre grey stone, built to withstand brutal Scottish winters, entirely devoid of gilded ceilings, grand ballrooms, or rooms for visiting dignitaries. It was designed for a single occupant. Former staff sworn to the site fee protocol recounted that the Queen would retreat there for 5 to 6 days at a time, continuing her work through daily red boxes but entirely out of sight. In the Grey House, she wasn't the Queen. She was Elizabeth, a woman alone with her thoughts, her history, and her family's legacy. Other royals had a far different relationship with the estate. Prince Philip, a man of motion, polo, and sport, reportedly despised the oppressive silence. Princess Anne found it eerie, too heavy with private reflections. Princess Margaret visited once, for less than 24 hours, and fled back to the bustling social life of Burke, and Charles, despite his deep love for Scotland, had never set foot inside. To him, the Grey House was simply a blank spot on a map. That ignorance would later become a crucial vulnerability when Camilla launched her campaign in 2025. What made the Grey House truly explosive wasn't the land itself, it was the archives it held. Handwritten letters, photographic negatives, private voice recordings never digitized or submitted to the Royal Archives at Windsor. Over 70 years of unfiltered, priceless history, waiting for a successor who understood that real power resides not in public display, but in secrecy and shadows. Elizabeth had already chosen that successor. The campaign for the Grey House did not explode into public view. It began quietly, in whispers echoing down the corridors of the Duchy of Lancaster. By autumn 2024, Camilla, 2 years into her reign, had begun noticing gaps in her influence. Unlike Elizabeth, whose legacy loomed mythically, Camilla was still consolidating power. She understood better than anyone that in royalty, influence is about symbols, narratives, and land, not simply titles. Internal palace documents, later leaked by disgruntled aides, reveal that Camilla had begun discreet inquiries into site fee accounts as early as October 2024. She never named the Grey House, because such a direct approach would have alarmed the old guard. Instead, she framed her investigations as routine administrative audits, probing whether any assets had been omitted from the duchy's estate records. Her reasoning was cold, pragmatic. Any unlisted property was a loose thread, one she could unravel, reweave, and ultimately claim. This campaign wasn't undertaken alone. The Parker Bowles family, long situated on the periphery of royal wealth, sensed an opportunity to cement their legacy. Tom Parker Bowles, accomplished food writer and brand strategist, had already been exploring high-end Highland culinary tourism ventures. Advisors quietly researched local zoning regulations months before the public knew of the Grey House. The estate represented far more than land. It was a strategic asset. Control of the Grey House meant control of the narrative of Elizabeth's private life, attaching their family name to the most intimate sanctuary of the House of Windsor. By early January 2026, the covert campaign moved from shadows into the private drawing rooms of Burke King, Charles's cherished Scottish residence. It was here that Camilla formally made her move during a private evening audience. Presenting Charles with an elegant, leather-bound proposal, she spoke not of takeover, but stewardship and restoration. Her pitch was polished, persuasive, and strategically framed. She suggested bringing the Grey House under joint crown management and integrating it into her own charitable foundations. Camilla proposed converting it into a literary retreat for British authors, launching conservation projects tied to rewilding, and offering exclusive invitation-only heritage tourism to fund the estate's upkeep for the next century. To anyone else, this would have looked like visionary preservation of a decaying relic. Beneath the carefully curated polish of her proposals, Queen Camilla's campaign for the Grey House was a calculated play for total dominion. By claiming management of the estate, she would gain not just property, but proximity to Balmoral's most secret and sensitive boundaries. Even more critically, she would secure access to the archives, the unseen lifeblood of Elizabeth II's private world. She was not merely seeking a cottage tucked in the Highlands, she was pursuing geography, influence, and leverage, a trifecta that could cement her legacy for generations. Yet, in her relentless drive, Camilla made a fatal tactical error, perhaps blinded by her sense of inevitable triumph. Weeks before formally presenting her plan to King Charles, she authorized a team of private surveyors to roam the Highland moors. Masked as environmental evaluators, these consultants carried high-tech equipment, mapping restoration budgets and plotting heritage programming initiatives. The movement of these outsiders, strange figures pacing the granite and pine wilderness, did not escape notice. Locals who had served the late Queen for decades, loyal custodians of her privacy, watched with unease, their loyalty silently resisting intrusion into a sacred domain. When Charles finally faced the leather-bound proposal, he did not respond with the fiery temper or sharp rebuke that palace insiders had come to expect. Instead, he employed a tactic that was far more royal and far more strategic. He stalled. Meetings were deferred, constitutional advisors consulted, and the Royal Estate Council asked to review ownership structures untouched since 1952. Charles was caught between loyalty to his wife and reverence for tradition, a man torn between affection and the weight of his mother's memory. He was being asked to hand over a ghost he had never seen, a sanctuary he did not know, to rewrite history in real time. That hesitation became the chink in Camilla's armor that Princess Anne, ever vigilant, was ready to exploit. The tension reached a boiling point during a closed session on January 12, 2026, attended only by the King, his private secretary, and 2 senior advisors. The meeting was meant to formalize the transfer of stewardship. Camilla's team was prepared with architectural renderings, environmental studies, and detailed plans. But Charles delivered a soft yet unyielding verdict. The estate was not for reassignment. Not now, not ever. Framing his refusal as adherence to a pre-existing private settlement beyond the reach of Crown review, he avoided making it personal, though every word carried the weight of a royal rebuke. The chamber went silent, cold as the Highland wind, as Camilla, architect of a multi-year campaign, left with her composure intact, but visibly shaken. She had marshalled every resource at her disposal, lawyers, planners, even influence over the King's court. Yet she had been blocked by a force she could neither see nor counter, and in that moment, a chilling realization settled over her. The late Queen had foreseen this very challenge years ago, appointing a guardian that no Queen consort could ever circumvent. Overnight, the Parker Bowles family's dreams of a Highland empire evaporated. Surveyors were recalled, heritage consultants silenced, and the once hopeful leather-bound proposals were relegated to dusty drawers. Yet this shock paled in comparison to the revelation that would strike the world and the Parker Bowles family. 3 days later, on January 15, 2026, Buckingham Palace made an announcement that was as quiet as it was seismic. It was more than a property transfer. It was a legal detonation, the fulfillment of a plan Queen Elizabeth II had set in motion years before her death, while global attention focused on funerals, ceremonies, and coronations. To understand why Camilla's campaign failed so spectacularly, one must examine a document signed in the shadowed library of Windsor Castle in October 2021. This was not the Queen's primary will, which addressed palaces, jewels, and official holdings. It was a separate, conditional personal legacy deed, a legal instrument designed to bypass conventional Crown estate channels entirely. It was the ultimate safeguard, the unbreachable fortress of Elizabeth's private will. At the heart of this document was Clause 31, whispered about by royal legal staff with awe and a hint of terror. Its name was a deliberate, poetic nod to the 31st day of the Queen's reign and to her first solitary visit to the Grey House. The clause was precise, merciless, and surgical. It stipulated 3 conditions that rendered the estate untouchable. First, The property would only transfer upon the death of all designated trustees. Second, it was permanently removed from parliamentary oversight and Crown review. And third, the most devastating blow for the Parker Bowles clan, Queen Camilla, her children, and their direct descendants were forever barred from access, ownership, or managerial influence over the estate. Only 4 people had known of Clause 31 before its revelation in 2026. The Queen's personal solicitor, Princess Anne, the Queen's longtime private archivist, and Prince Edward. Each had sworn an oath of secrecy that surpassed even their official royal duties. They had watched in silence as Camilla's surveyors roamed the moors, as her advisers pressed Charles at Burker, knowing all along that the estate's fate was sealed. The burning question remained: why Lady Louise? Why had the Queen placed her 22-year-old granddaughter, never a working royal, unaccustomed to public duty, in charge of her most intimate sanctuary? The answer lay in summers spent together in 2019, 2020, and 2021. While other royals arrived at Balmoral with agendas, staff lists, and social ambitions, Louise arrived with little more than a book and a pair of walking boots. Former palace staff observed a dynamic that few others ever glimpsed: the Queen and Louise moving silently through the private libraries, walking hidden corridors, speaking softly among the whispers of history. Louise was not performing, not waiting to please. She simply existed in the Queen's presence, absorbing the legacy of decades and learning the architecture of memory. Elizabeth, recognizing in her granddaughter echoes of Princess Margaret, razor-sharp intellect, devotion to history, a love for life without spectacle, knew that Louise would preserve the grey house with reverence, not ambition. By bypassing her own children and gifting the estate to Louise, Elizabeth effectively handed her granddaughter a moral dowry, a fortress of private authority beyond politics or public scrutiny. The deed, signed shortly after Prince Philip's funeral, emphasised sanctuary over monument, the protection of memory over display. The archives, unfiltered diaries, recordings for grandchildren, candid correspondence with world leaders, were to remain private, entrusted to someone who valued the woman more than the crown. The shockwaves that hit the senior courtiers and the Parker Bowles family were unprecedented. They had been outmanoeuvred by a girl, a 22-year-old with no need for public validation, who now held the keys to the most significant pieces of the monarchy's private history. Louise possessed what no museum could showcase, what no king could reclaim. When news of the inheritance broke in London in January 2026, the city buzzed with astonishment and quiet admiration. Lady Louise emerged as a refreshing symbol of tradition, discretion, and loyalty. Meanwhile, inside Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentment. Queen Camilla, renowned for her tenacity and political acumen, was being publicly and privately sidelined by a teenager wielding an ironclad deed. The confrontation that palace staff would whisper about for months occurred on January 26th in the long gallery of Windsor Castle, a scene later described as a chandelier moment, where tension hung so heavily in the air it seemed the crystal above might shatter. Camilla, visibly trembling with fury and disbelief, confronted Princess Anne. She accused the Princess Royal of undermining her authority, of manipulating a child into seizing a spotlight that should have belonged to the reigning sovereign's household. Camilla's argument rested on modern monarchy and administrative rationale. She claimed Louise was never meant to be a working royal and lacked the training to manage such immense responsibility. Giving her the Grey House, she argued, disrupted the king's carefully planned vision for a streamlined monarchy. Yet Princess Anne, stoic and unflinching, responded with the weight of decades of experience and loyalty to her mother's wishes. Looking directly at the Queen Consort, Anne delivered a line that landed like the strike of a guillotine. "Neither were you." The silence that followed was described as funeral grade, cold, absolute. Camilla left without another word, the encounter echoing in palace corridors like a secret storm. In the quiet of her private chambers, Camilla's composure finally snapped, but the battle for control was no longer confined to the drawing rooms of Windsor. Beyond the polished halls, a far more modern, subtle, and dangerous conflict was unfolding. Duchess Sophie Louise's mother had anticipated this fallout for nearly a year, leveraging decades of expertise in public relations and crisis management. Before marrying into the royal family, Sophie had developed an acute understanding of the power of leaks, whispers, and character assaults. She knew the moment the Parker Bowles family realized they had been legally outmaneuvered, they might resort to less official methods, sabotage, intrusion, or subtle interference. In late 2025, just as the inheritance process was nearing completion, Sophie quietly authorized a top-tier cybersecurity audit of the Grey House and its surrounding lands. The results were alarming. Multiple attempts had been made to scan the property via drones, likely seeking architectural vulnerabilities or hidden entrances. More disturbing were reports from local estate workers of small remote trail cameras positioned along the northern tree line, clearly aimed at monitoring anyone entering or leaving the estate. While the culprits were never publicly identified, the sophistication and cost of the equipment suggested a well-funded and highly coordinated operation. Sophie acted swiftly. She coordinated with the Duke of Edinburgh's office to install military-grade jamming technology and ensured Louise's personal protection detail consisted of officers whose loyalty to the late Queen was absolute. While Sophie maintained the digital and physical boundaries, Prince Edward was charged with holding the line internally, within the family itself. In November 2025, Camilla reportedly made a final attempt to delay the process. She personally called Edward, framing the request as one of family unity and suggesting that the public announcement of Louise's inheritance be postponed, supposedly to protect the young woman from media scrutiny. But Edward, often considered the gentlest of the royal siblings, displayed a steely resolve few expected. He recognized the true intent, a stalling tactic designed to give Camilla's lawyers time to exploit loopholes in the Crown Archives Act. His refusal was simple, unyielding, and devastating in its clarity. "My daughter will not be a placeholder for your ambitions. You had your turn." With those 15 words, the final internal barrier protecting Louise crumbled. By the end of January 2026, the power dynamic within Windsor had shifted irrevocably. Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and Sophie had formed an unbreakable protective ring around Louise, shielding her from both the king's hesitation and Camilla's relentless ambition. Together, they had honoured the late Queen's final wish, not just in letter, but in spirit. Camilla, for the first time in her public life, found herself in a paradoxical position. She was the Queen consort, she held the crown, and she commanded the king's attention. Yet, against a quiet young woman in the Highlands, she was functionally powerless. The inheritance was finalised. The deed had been transferred. The Grey House remained a fortress of memory, a sanctuary that Camilla would never enter. For the first time since Elizabeth II's passing, the Old Guard had claimed a decisive victory. They had done so by placing their faith in the youngest member of their flock, a granddaughter who had spent 22 years in quiet preparation. On a brisk afternoon in late January 2026, the world finally caught a glimpse of Lady Louise Windsor, not as a peripheral royal, but as the true ideological successor to her grandmother. The setting could not have been more understated. Greyfriars Church, a centuries-old chapel carved from the same rugged stone as the Highlands themselves, stood just miles from the gates of the Grey House. There were no camera crews, no red carpets, no media barricades. Louise arrived in a simple dark coat, accompanied by a single protection officer who maintained respectful distance. Her entrance was a deliberate rejection of the high production appearances favoured by other branches of the royal family, but it was a single, subtle detail that captured the attention of both historians and the royal press corps. Pinned to her lapel was an antique brooch of silver thistle and Tudor roses, centred by a small diamond heart. At first glance, it seemed merely decorative, but for those familiar with the private archives of the House of Windsor, the piece was unmistakable. It was an Edwardian original, but its true significance lay in a discreet engraving on the reverse, for service, not spectacle. This was no public slogan. It was a private motto used exclusively by Queen Elizabeth II in handwritten correspondence with only 3 people: Princess Anne, Prince Philip, and Lady Louise herself. By wearing it, Louise was sending a clear signal. She had been initiated into a level of royal intimacy, that even Queen Camilla had never attained. The brooch symbolized the inheritance of character and duty, the passing of moral authority from grandmother to granddaughter. After lighting a candle and placing flowers on the altar, Louise approached the microphone. Ostensibly, she had come to speak on behalf of a local Highland charity, but what she delivered instead would reverberate around the world. Her voice, steady and measured, filled the centuries-old chapel. "The house I inherited is not a trophy," she began. "I do not claim it because of my name, but because of what I have learned from those who came before me: quiet loyalty, private strength, and a faith that does not perform but protects." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, landing on the small congregation before seeming to pierce the very heart of the monarchy. "I will not run from the inheritance of character, and I will not allow its memory to be rewritten for convenience." The phrase, "rewritten for convenience," carried an unmistakable weight, a direct critique of the branding and modernization campaigns led by Queen Camilla's office. Louise's statement was subtle in delivery, but devastating in implication. She did not seek applause or media attention. She turned instead to a small stone plaque behind the altar, engraved with one of her grandmother's most famous lines from her first Christmas broadcast. "It is not the crown that grants duty, it is duty that gives meaning to the crown." Within an hour, recordings of the speech had spread from local Scottish social media to global news networks, viewed by over 15 million people by evening. The impact was profound, but the most decisive reaction came from within the royal family. Princess Catherine posted a single high-resolution photograph of a handwritten note on her personal social media. "Legacy is not what we receive, it is what we choose to preserve." Signed simply C and tagged with #GRHouse and #WindsorDuty, the post was a seismic shift in royal optics. Catherine's tacit endorsement effectively isolated Camilla's narrative, signalling her support for Louise as the rightful custodian of Elizabeth's legacy. Within 20 minutes, the post had garnered over 3 million likes, a level of engagement surpassing any post from official royal accounts since the coronation. Inside the palace, the Royal Continuity Office convened an emergency session. Their data revealed a startling truth. The public was not merely admiring Louise, they were holding her up as the moral benchmark against which all other royals would now be measured. The Parker Bowles family's spectacle had been replaced by quiet, principled authority. The courtiers realised the monarchy's moral centre of gravity had shifted, and it existed entirely outside the control of King Charles or Queen Camilla. The strongest affirmation came from Princess Anne herself. When asked at a naval charity event whether Louise was overstepping her rank, she offered a rare, sharp smile and said simply, "Lady Louise speaks not as a future monarch, but as a guardian of what cannot be inherited, moral authority. Her voice is her own, and it is clear." By the end of January 2026, the battle for the Grey House had evolved into a contest far greater than property or private letters. It had become a struggle for the very soul of the monarchy. Louise had demonstrated that one need not hold a crown to lead, nor a stage to be heard. She had replaced the Parker Bowles family's ambition with her grandmother's principles and reminded the world that the most enduring power a royal can possess is not land or titles, but the trust and respect of the people. As snow blanketed the Cairngorms, the girl who had spent 22 years in the shadows finally stepped into the light. By early February 2026, Lady Louise Windsor's name had moved from obscurity to the forefront of global conversation. From the moment the public learned of her inheritance, Lady Louise Windsor was no longer just the quiet granddaughter tucked away in the margins of royal life. She had become a symbol, a living embodiment of the values her grandmother had quietly championed for decades. Newspapers across the United Kingdom began publishing editorials calling her the Queen's true heir in spirit, a title weightier than any formal honour or ceremonial designation could ever confer. Even the most seasoned royal commentators noted the remarkable shift. The monarchy was beginning to be defined not by titles or spectacle, but by character and discretion. On February 5, 2026, a BBC poll revealed a stunning shift in public sentiment. 71% of Britons believed Lady Louise should receive a formal title and full royal status in Scotland, where the story of the Grey House had resonated most profoundly. By the evening of February 7th, support had climbed to an astonishing 84%. Sensing that the monarchy's moral compass was drifting outside the palace's control, King Charles III decided it was time to act. He extended a formal proposal to his niece, full elevation to Her Royal Highness, Princess Louise. The king envisioned her leading initiatives in youth education, cultural preservation, and intergenerational leadership programs, a modern royal figurehead meant to bridge tradition and contemporary engagement. Yet the offer came with unmistakable constraints. Louise would be required to reside part-time in London, undergo formal security evaluations, and most painfully, abandon her private pursuits, including the equestrian coaching that had kept her grounded and connected to everyday life. The offer split the royal household into two clear factions. Princess Anne, ever cautious yet pragmatic, expressed measured support, believing Louise could fulfill her duties without compromising her core identity. Duchess Sophie, however, was visibly emotional in private discussions with aides. She admitted her concern was not for the title itself, but for the weight it carried, a weight that had crushed the ambitions of many before Louise, leaving them trapped in gilded cages of duty and expectation. Outside the palace, the situation grew even more complex. On February 8th, Meghan Markle appeared on a US talk show, delivering a series of veiled remarks widely interpreted as a critique of Louise's sudden rise. "When people are elevated based on silence rather than service," she said, "we must ask ourselves what values are truly being rewarded." Though she never mentioned Louise by name, the implication was unmistakable. Almost instantly, the hashtag #SilencePR began trending, largely amplified by networks and social media accounts affiliated with the Duchess of Sussex's brand. The backlash within the United Kingdom was swift and severe. In a rare joint statement, Princess Anne and Prince Edward bypassed the King's official press office to defend their daughter with precision. "Lady Louise Windsor has neither asked for a throne nor a stage," they wrote. "She has only ever accepted responsibility when others discarded it." Their words sent a clear message. Louise's rise was not ambition-driven, but rooted in principle and duty. 2 days later, standing on the steps of the Grey House amid soft Highland snowfall, Louise delivered her answer to the King's proposal. The announcement, streamed live to over 9 million viewers, was not the grandiose acceptance speech the King had anticipated. Her breath visible in the cold air, she stated calmly, "I am grateful for my family's trust, but I believe duty does not require a title. For now, I remain simply Lady Louise." The refusal was a masterstroke of humility and strategy. By declining elevation, she became something far more potent than a formal royal. She became a figure whose authority emanated from choice, not decree. Days later, it was confirmed that King Charles had personally hand-delivered a letter to her, a rare tradition not observed since Queen Elizabeth II wrote to Prince William on the eve of his investiture. Reportedly, the letter contained a line that moved Louise to tears. "Your grandmother believed that greatness grows in silence. I now see she was speaking of you." By mid-February, a new moral axis had formed within the monarchy. On one side were those leveraging titles, media presence, and ceremonial prestige to shape narratives and assert influence. On the other was Lady Louise, who, by declining the title, had earned universal respect. She had inherited not just a secret estate, but the ethical foundation of the crown itself. She faced criticism without retaliation, rejected vanity when it was easiest to accept, and reminded the world that true strength is measured by integrity, not spectacle. Louise's rise marked a profound cultural shift. The Grey House had not only preserved Queen Elizabeth's unfiltered voice, but had become a symbol of what a modern monarchy could embody: moral clarity, quiet resilience, and principled stewardship. The public's fascination was not rooted in pomp or drama, but in the recognition that sometimes the most influential figure is the one who refuses to perform. By the winter of 2026, Lady Louise had firmly established herself as the guardian of the Grey House, a figure whose quiet authority eclipsed the ambitions of those wielding power through titles or media campaigns. The lesson of the Grey House was clear. Duty is a silent pact, not a public display. By remaining steadfastly herself, Louise had demonstrated that the most enduring legacy is not what is displayed for the world, but what is preserved for those one trusts most. Her story is a reminder that real power does not demand visibility, and moral authority cannot be bought or assigned. It must be earned, often in the shadows. Lady Louise Windsor did not simply inherit an estate, she inherited a soul. And in protecting that soul, she safeguarded the very essence of the crown itself. In an era where everyone seeks to be seen and heard, perhaps the greatest act of courage is the choice to remain invisible, yet unyielding in principle. What do you think Queen Elizabeth would say today to her granddaughter, the guardian of the Grey House? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we continue to follow the legacy of the Windsor family.